Mr Speaker.
David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I acknowledge the officials that are in the House today to see the first reading, or to witness the first reading of this free trade agreement with Korea, which I think, after 5 long years of pretty tough negotiations, and I go into some of the details of why they were so tough in a minute, have resulted in what I would consider and what we consider a pretty good agreement. And for that reason, Labor is supporting this bill, which aims to reduce the remaining few tariffs that could be imposed on Korea to enable us to get this free trade agreement into effect and to start reaping the benefits from it. So this party, the Labor Party, is a party that supports free trade agreements. We implemented more free trade agreements under our term in office, sir, than certainly the other side has, but we were supported by the other side, and I think that was the point of the last speaker. 31% of our GDP is dependent on exports. Unfortunately, that figure is dropping. It was 31% actually, it's now down to 29%, despite the government's target of increasing it up to 40%. But one of the most important issues and one of the factors in keeping that up was our free trade agreement with China. And I ask you to think of what the situation would have been like going into 2008 with the financial crisis in front of us if we did not have that free trade agreement with China. $2.2 billion is what we were exporting to China in 2008. By 2014, it had gone up to $10 billion. $10 billion. And China had become our largest trading partner. Now, you can aim whatever criticism you like at that free trade agreement, sir, but without that, we would be lacking the growth and the jobs that had sustained us through that period of the financial crisis. If we hadn't had that free trade agreement, sir, we would have been in a much worse state than we are at the moment. So for the Greens and New Zealand First, who both opposed that free trade agreement, to stand up here and talk about the woes and the ills of free trade agreements, sir, it's a bit rich. It's a bit rich. And to oppose this free trade agreement, sir, when there are so many benefits coming to New Zealand, I think it's a bit rich as well. And it makes me think that if their vote was the deciding vote of whether this agreement came into being or not, would they actually do it, or whether they are just, in a sense, luxuriating in the fact that they're in opposition. Then they're an opposition party where the vote actually doesn't matter because they've got the Labor Party here to actually support it. And my feeling, sir, is if they didn't, then they would be doing New Zealanders out of jobs and New Zealand out of growth that they could have otherwise had. Sir, the free trade agreement with Korea, as I said, 5 years of negotiations that came about, and they were tough negotiations, as we were told by the officials, because basically New Zealand is really pretty open. We will be taking off and going without $4.2 million of tariffs that we might otherwise collect from Korea. But we will be earning we will get $220 million worth of tariffs removed from our exports. So immediately we will start benefiting from having those gone. It will put us on a level playing field with the EU, with Australia, with the US, with Canada, with Chile. All of these countries have negotiated free trade agreements with South Korea before us. So it's not just about the tariffs that happen right now, but it means that we will be able to compete with those countries into the future. And that's the important point, that Korea, which is currently our 6th largest trading partner, has the potential to grow much, much more. And the example of Chile is an important one. Chile, who entered into a free trade agreement with South Korea much earlier, now has 0 tariffs on its kiwi fruit. We will have around about 42% tariff on our kiwi fruit exports to Korea. So we are now going to be able to benefit and be able to compete much more effectively with countries like Chile. So the benefits are huge. And sir, we're just going through it, 45% in kiwi fruit, 40% in the meat industry, Fonterra, fisheries, forestry. And yet we heard from many of the submitters that came before the Select Committee that somehow, and I quote two or three of them, that this free trade agreement would benefit the few at the expense of the many. Well, look, these are those industries, which are our core industries in New Zealand, employ hundreds of thousands of people. No, this is an agreement which will benefit the many at the expense of the few. This is about us growing jobs, growing our economy, and benefiting all New Zealanders. So this, as I said, means that we will reduce our tariffs. This bill, what we're looking at today, will reduce the tariffs that are applied to Korea at the moment. It'll be a cost to us of about $4.2 million, but at the benefit of more than $200 million in reduced tariffs to our exports overseas. So many of the people that came before us, has been spoken about before, had a number of issues around the entering free trade agreements. I will say one thing that I think the government has been very remiss on, and that is that it has not been an advocate of what really constitutes a free trade agreement, and particularly not only in Korea but more broadly with the issue of the TPPA. When we were negotiating with China, if you go back and take a look at the records, and Phil Goff can I'm sure support this, the Labor government went through extraordinary lengths to make sure that we had a wide cross-section of society on board. When we were in the Select Committee the other day, and we were asking the Ministry of Foreign Affairs how much outreach had actually been going on, other than business groups, over the course of a year, there would have been maybe 5 or 6 civil society groups that had been actually talked to about the TPPA and free trade agreements. That means that out there is I believe, a wrong impression of the value of free trade agreements versus the costs or the risks to New Zealand. And it's time that the government woke up to this fact and actually went out there, got down and actually talked with the people rather than being arrogant and high-handed as unfortunately they have been, and started talking about free trade agreements. So the ISDS, the investor-state dispute settlement procedures that have been talked about, they were talked about mainly with regard to the TPP. We have to look very carefully at these. They are not perfect by any means, and I think some of the submitters made some very good submissions on this, but on the other hand, they are not kangaroo courts, as was often as referred to. In the case of the Korea Free Trade Agreement, it was Korea that insisted that we go into a free trade, an ISDS procedure, include that in the free trade agreement. We insisted that we included as part of the Chinese free trade agreement, because it gave us a certainty that we could go at least somewhere where we didn't necessarily have confidence in the particular country's judicial procedures. So the ISDS, if we take a look at what has come about through the ISDS, there's been 356 concluded cases, 37% of those in favour of the state, 25% in favour of the investor, and 28% have been settled. In 44 claims against the OECD countries, the state won 86% of the time. So New Zealand's not about to be taken to the cleaners here. And it's the second obvious point. We have never been taken to an ISDR dispute tribunal before. There's never been a case that was seen to have been able to stack up. We've never been taken to the WHO procedures either. So we've got to get this in perspective a little bit. We're not saying that what we're seeing here is perfect, but what we do need to know is that there is a settlement procedure out there that is not in any way as broken as many people would like to profess. I will say one thing that I believe that the government has not been able to answer properly, and David Parker spoke on it before, and that is the area of residential houses and overseas investment into our residential market. Like all New Zealanders, I don't want to see our residences, our homes, our houses treated like pork bellies on the New York Exchange. And I don't believe, and according to Professor Kawharo, who gave evidence in front of us,
I'm sorry to interrupt the honourable member.
That hasn't been addressed fully either.
expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Gian